He was deeply formed by the Heidegger of it all. For one reason or another, he saw the limitations, but he was trying to rescue some critical tools and bring them into a historical materials framework. Now, whether that's ultimately successful, I think all four of us tend to think he probably did the best that one could do.
What's Left of Philosophy. I'm Lillian, and here with me today, as usual, is Gil, Owen, and Will. Hey, guys.
Hello. Hey, everyone.
Yo.
So our episode today is about Herbert Marcuse. Herbert Marcuse was a German-American philosopher. He was born in Berlin in 1898 and then died in the U.S. in 1979. He did research in Berlin and Freiburg, which is relevant background information under the study of Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger. He did his habilitation on Hegel, which is the second PhD that German philosophers have to do. And in this dissertation, he tried to marry phenomenology and historical materialism. And I started the reading that I gave the group to read today to start in this earlier period in the late 1920s. And so for people who don't know, phenomenology is the study of the appearance of things, how we experience things, and thus meaning. Heidegger was very important for this area of philosophical research, and importantly, the habilitation project was opposed by Heidegger, and Marcuse later moved on, joined the Institute for Social Research at Frankfurt on Adorno's recommendation in the early 1930s, and his lasting legacy was as a member of the Frankfurt School, but also as sort of the grandfather philosopher of the New Left. So there are a bunch of controversies surrounding Marcuse having to do with free speech, his essay on repressive tolerance, one-dimensional man. But we're actually not going to talk about that today. I mean, it might come up, but we're not really doing that. So I'm going to call this the B-side Marcuse mixtape that we're recording here. So what we're reading, it's a sort of a historical arc, a chapter from a collection of essays called Heideggerian Marxism, a chapter from Eros and Civilization, published in the 50s, and then after that, One-Dimensional Man, published in the 1960s, for which he is best known. I'd like to introduce Marcuse by saying that I think the through line in all of his thinking is alienation. And it's the primary diagnosis that he makes of the modern period. So we've talked in various episodes about these central Marxian concepts, exploitation, alienation, reification. The Frankfurt School is famously very preoccupied with alienation and reification, and I think that Marcuse is the one who is most preoccupied with alienation. And I think that with Horkheimer and Adorno, you get more of the reification side, but obviously they all intersect. So what Marcuse tries to do from the late 1920s is to refit Heidegger's critique of modernity to the post-war period of affluence and mass culture. So he takes Heideggerian concepts like everydayness and thrownness, and he tries to reformulate them to become a critique of not just modernity as such, but of mass society, that kind of everyday existence of people in what he calls administered world. He tries to make sense of what it means to be thrown into a world that one does not create, and how to not only think about history, and so he uses the Heideggerian concept of historicity to talk about the experience of being thrown into a set of determinations and how to act on historical necessity. So I think that the main question that he's trying to figure out is that given certain conditions, how do you live an authentic life? How can you live authentically, or even make authentic life possible in such a world that is characterized by alienation, commodity fetishism, and so on? So I think that what Marcuse tries to do is flip around some of what Heidegger is doing, which is normally called anti-humanism. Humanism is a sort of human-centered way of doing social criticism, where you take human rationality as a method, that you take your primary interest to be the humanity and its fate and what it can accomplish and how it relates to itself. So Heidegger is an anti-humanist. I think that's how people usually characterize him. But Marcuse tries to use these phenomenological concepts to try to articulate how an authentic life can be possible, because he wants to make life fit for humanity. He wants to figure out how can such subjects who are constrained and determined in such ways create revolutionary acts. How can they come into being? And in the middle of his career, so in the 50s, I don't know if it's the middle exactly, but in the 50s, he takes a turn away from Heidegger into Freud. But I think he starts asking the same question. He wants to know what it means, how to live a more authentic life. And he starts to think about sexuality as a way of answering that question. So he talks about what, like, living in a repressed sexual society. And then he starts to use Freudian concepts instead to talk about how to release the confines of like modern sexuality from the constraints of the performance principle and of instrumental reason and industrial society. And I think for Marcuse, non-alienated labor, a freed eros, a freed libidinal energy would start to look like non-alienated labor. So the idea is to transform the sexual energy of human beings such that work becomes a matter of libidinal pleasure. And so there's this kind of very 1960s, presaging the 1960s sexual revolution, in which you start thinking of all the things that humanity could be capable of if it wasn't so neurotic and punishing of itself. So he starts to talk about the libidinal economy that must change alongside the actual economy. And he tries to think about whether or not it's possible to build a civilization on a different basis, because Freud talks about repression and sublimation as just facts of civilization. And Marcuse wants to know, is it possible to think about this as no longer the necessary preconditions for civilization, because we don't have the same constraints on the human species that we used to at this level of development. And instead, what we seem to have is a bunch of narcissistic neurotics who have like a narrow object-oriented sexual life. And he starts to kind of carry this thesis through in One-Dimensional Man. And he sees, instead of sexuality becoming a liberatory force, he sees it as instead something that is attached to the wrong things, the wrong objects, to commodification, to consumerism. And that's why people become neurotic, like they turn inward and start to punish themselves and others. So this is a hostile and alienated form of subjectivity that is reified by mass culture. So by the end of One-Dimensional Man, reification starts to enter the picture. And I think what he's basically doing is he's trying to seek avenues for self-determination in the post-war period. And I think that it's also a decisive turn away from the problem of exploitation to that of alienation, which is why people tend to think about the Frankfurt School and the New Left as its influence on the New Left as being a turn toward culturalism. But what's really in the background, I think, is a search for a new revolutionary subject. He doesn't think the working class can be that subject anymore. And so he's trying to find, whether it's through potential sexual revolution or the various new social movements that start to happen in the 60s, he's looking for that subject. And I think that that is what makes it so distinctively of the New Left, because by the time you get to the 80s, critical theorists stop looking for that subject. And I think that's why he's so paradigmatic for that generation. So I will leave it to the rest of you all to tell me what you thought about three pretty different eras in Marcuse's life.
Yeah, I'll start. Well, I'll just start by saying this, that I was kind of shocked by just how in the Heideggerian weeds he was in this late 20s essay. So Being in Time is 1927, and he writes this piece, Contributions to a Phenomenology of Historical Materialism, in 1928. So it's 1 year later, and he is full-throated Heideggerian phenomenological existential ontology. like he does even there have problems with Heidegger, which is interesting, in which he is already trying to articulate, and I think it's going to be the basis for like a full break with Heidegger in the years that follow, by like the 1930s, when Heidegger is appointed as the rector, I think at Freiburg, and then joins the Nazi party. You know, Marcuse breaks with him very decisively, and they, you know, he meets with him and is like, "Are you going to renounce this?" And he's like, "No, actually, I think that stuff's cool, actually." But
Heidegger's like, I'm real good. There's
still
no
with
way
it. Yeah.
this won't look great 20 years down the road.
No, when we were talking about historical destiny, you thought about class struggle and revolution. I was thinking about like national destiny.
The real way being can express itself so we could recover it. Yes.
So I think there's something interesting about, you know, thinking about why he abandons Heidegger and why he abandons Heideggerian approaches, but also maybe we could start out by asking, like, thinking a little bit about what was attractive to him in the first place about this new sort of thing that was happening with Heidegger. And he himself says in a bunch of places that it seemed to him, it seemed to a lot of people at the time, Arendt, whatever, a bunch of other people who were his students, Heidegger students, that he represented a new, more concrete approach to philosophy, that the kind of then dominant philosophical tendencies of like neo-Kantianism, of positivism, were very abstract and very idealist. And by thinking about things like, what is it like an average and everyday situation, and thinking about things like, anxiety, boredom, like that seemed, it felt to them that this was a concrete philosophy, one that actually spoke to, like, you know, lived human needs, ironically enough, given Heidegger's supposed anti-humanism, as he said. So I think that's interesting. And then, of course, the interesting thing is, like, you know, Marcuse, bless him, unlike a lot of other people, comes to his senses and realizes that actually this isn't a concrete philosophy at all, right? That, like, with the Heideggerian sort of approach, actually it's very abstract, you know, that, you know, we're actually not talking about historical material reality at all. We get more and more sort of otherworldly as Heidegger's own project develops, but the seeds are already there in being in time.
Yeah, I think like one through line from that Heidegger stuff to the later stuff is, you know, because he abandons Heidegger and then he turns to Freud, and he seems to be like looking, and I guess one of my questions would be is, why was he so drawn to searching outside of Marxism in order to, what does he think Marxism needs to be supplemented with, that he was looking for in Heidegger and then like broke with and then really looked for in psychoanalysis? And I think it has to do with, I mean, I like that you emphasized in your introduction, Lillian, the that he was looking for a new subject, and that it was really, yes, it's alienation, and in a broader sense, it's like the problem of the subject in Marxian social theory. And he seems to find resources for thinking through subjectivity. I mean, he sees it in early on in like the concepts of authenticity in Heidegger, and living an authentic life and resoluteness and all of that. And then later on, like, you know, after he abandons that, he finds, conceptualizes this notion of non-repressive desublimation. We can talk about that later, but it's a kind of liberated libidinal life, right? So yeah, maybe it's the through line. I think one place to start would be that the through line seems to have to do with trying to think through the subject, the nature of subjectivity, in ways that I guess he thinks Marxism on its own isn't sufficient to do. It's more of he thinks it's better as a theory of reification, as a theory of the object.
Yeah, I mean, I gotta say, all three of you said this. I had to dust off the old, tomes to get through Heideggerian Marxism. My goodness. I mean, I think one of the reasons why I found it, kind of hard to get through, I'm not shading Heidegger yet. But it's that, Marcuse, the follow-up on what Owen was saying is Marcuse is actually trying to do a normative project with this Heideggerian infrastructure. But, and I get it, Heideggerians will find some way to attenuate and complicate this claim. It's always more complicated. But being in time is not a straightforward normative project. Yes, when he says, Das Man, it can seem like he's critical of Das Man. And then, whenever you're like in the seminar, you're like, oh yeah, so Heidegger thinks Das Man is that. No. Das Man is a modality of the existential, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's not supposed to be, a straightforward normative proposal. But when Marcuse is talking about authenticity, he actually thinks that this is, an actual political project. And at least Heidegger, and also, again, Heidegger technically didn't finish being in time, but Heidegger tries to say this is not moralistic. This is not a politics. And so what I see him doing is, I actually think about it in my head. I don't know if this is completely right, that he thinks that the Marxian critique got capitalism correct. I think what he's attracted to with, Heidegger and then Freud is that we now have a paradigm for what has happened to the subject in 20th century modernity. And so it seems like he's trying to bring the critique of capitalism and the critique of modernity together in order to understand something like, and this sounds banal to say it, but what is different from when the time that Marx was writing? What new problems or new concepts or new frameworks do we need in order to deal with this moment from the 1920s up into the 1960s? And so I think sometimes people are like, the critique of capitalism is different than the critique of modernity, or, we have to think them together. I think that this is what he's struggling with. He is trying to struggle with, it's not just capitalism as a mode of production, but, what does it mean to be, sorry for the jargon, thrown as these types of creatures that have inherited also the philosophical architecture that has come with modernity and industrial society. So I think he thinks that this is a conjuncture that requires this type of mediation that will supplement Marxist thought if we're going to think the subject.
I think he did think that, and I think that I guess what I was struck by was the interest in authenticity that Marcuse puts forward. Yeah. He's very unashamed of this, and he means it in, I think, a totally different way than Heidegger does.
Right.
I think he means it in a different way in the sense that he wants to know how the subject can relate to itself in an unalienated way, and he sees the reasons for alienation as being a part of the social structure, whereas Heidegger's theoretical architecture is like militantly anti-materialist in that way. So finding the source of alienation in the social structure is the most superficial level of critique for Heidegger. And I think that, but what's compelling about it is that Heidegger points out this sense of alienation in this much more mystical way. But when he talks about anxiety, about the thrownness, about the lack of sense of being able to control that, like part of the promise of Marxism is that rational creatures like ourselves can, in fact, get some control over it. And he wants to know, given this existential experience that I'm having of feeling totally the opposite of that way, how can a subject who feels like me do anything different than what I already am? So there's this almost, I think that's why it's like a interest in phenomenology, like the part of what it is like to experience that problem really interests him.
Yeah. All the facets of the experience of alienation.
Yeah, and okay, so this is, I think out of the four of us, I'm going to be the friendliest to Heidegger right now. But I don't know, like, when Heidegger is doing these analyses of anxiety and trying to also, however this ends up, but, I think also Heidegger's trying to develop a novel concept of freedom that isn't, simply determinism, but also isn't simply voluntarism. Marcuse also is very, very drawn to this. He tries to put together why necessity and freedom aren't necessarily opposites, that, there is a notion of freedom of being able to actually stand within and act within your historically determined time rather than thinking you can escape it. And so, what I was going to say is, when Heidegger is talking about anxiety and all of that, I think that there is a way, if you are warm to Marxism, it's just like, well, he's actually keying into something that could really be explained by, transformations in the mode of production. The world determines you, but you're not quite sure who is determining you, where this influence is coming from. The world seems to be slipping away. All that solid melts into air, et cetera, et cetera. So I can see why someone would think maybe we can use these tools now that we are in a more fully industrialized and developed mode of capitalism to actually get into what is the structure of the subject now under these new conditions. And so Marcuse is trying to bring this together and say, we also just need a novel, robust account of freedom that can think the subject in history, that isn't simply, I can do whatever I want, but also isn't simply mechanistically determined by whatever came before. And that might end up being kind of mystical, but I think at least the Heideggerian Marxism, Marcuse, like that's what a lot of these people think that they're doing. We're going to develop a new ground for freedom as such.
Yeah, I think that accounts for a lot of the appeal that his work later has. And I know that there's like a caricature of the kind of like hippie, or even a caricature of like this of like sexual liberation or something, that where it is a kind of voluntarist like act of freedom. And
let's just be chill, man. Oh no, I became that guy.
Yeah, exactly. But we should be clear that I think even from this early work all the way through the later stuff, that like Marcuse always pairs these like calls for liberation with an account of like what has to happen at a macro structural level, at the economic level, in order for this to be possible, right? So like he's not like he says at one point something really funny in Eros and Civilization, like where he's like, listen, I'm not talking about a society of sex maniacs.
Yeah, I was just like oh, and damn, I thought
feel
you
like
were. Oh, okay.
I feel like some folks in the 60s didn't get
True.
the memo
That was what I was reading into this. Thanks for clarifying.
Yeah. So he's like, listen, I'm talking about like a world that is like, where we're, a liberated world that is invested with joy and pleasure in all facets of life. And this is only going to happen through a centrally planned like economy with democratic aspects. You know what I mean? Like, but a centrally planned economy in which we utilize rationally all of these technological and industrial forces that we have at our disposal, and we remake institutions.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like a totally transformed world is the world in which all of this great liberatory sexual stuff can happen, right? Like, not like at Woodstock.
Not at Woodstock.
Yeah, going to Burning Man or Fire Festival. That's not quite what Marcuse was talking about.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe we can obviously go back to the Heideggerian Marxism stuff, but I guess we can move to this 1950s middle period stuff of Eros and Civilization, because I was just completely bowled over by this. Because what's really fascinating is Marcuse never gives himself the easy out. He's like, what I'm talking about, he's calling this like a reconstructed Freudianism. So partially he's trying to say people have taken up Freud, have gotten it wrong, and he also thinks Freud got some things wrong. But he's trying to say, we have all of these instincts and forces that make up ourselves at this pre-subjective level, and we live under these conditions of affluence and labor that distort these energies, that make it seem as if their only release can be in terms of this exploitative structure. But he's like, but let's be clear. Like, I'm not saying that if we go back 300 years, let's just have a bacchanalia of, sexual liberation. He's like, no. Some sublimation and repression was necessary for us to develop our knowledge and technology to become orderly people. And so he's responding to people who might misunderstand him.
People.
Wait, I'm sorry?
Did you say orderly people?
Did I? I mean, wow. That feels like a Freudian slip. I don't know. Like, oops.
I'm into it. I'm not. No, I wasn't.
Let's be orderly. Let's do it. Enough. Y'all too free out here.
Yeah.
But I think it's really important for him that he's saying what I'm describing doesn't mean we're turning back the clock. In fact, what I'm describing is only possible because the instruments of production and level of technical knowledge have reached a certain point. He's like, only now can we actually have, this fun, joyous thing. But without it, he's like, yeah, you're right. Civilization would not have become anything. We've just been stuck in the mud like pigs.
Yeah.
So, you're welcome for that image, by the way, of just, these humans just rolling around in the mud, just pure genital fixation.
Again, Woodstock. Yeah,
exactly.
So it was fascinating to me, like to connect this through line. I like the direction that we're going here, because my red alert starts going off the minute anyone starts talking about authenticity. I just for me, like, authenticity is like, we're already doing fascism. Like when people start talking about being authentic.
Whoa!
This is my worry.
My
right?
man.
This is what I'm always worried about.
Fash?
Yeah.
Okay.
People start talking about being authentic, and I get nervous, and I start looking around to see if they're locking the doors. You
You reach for your gun.
I reach for my gun. So it's interesting that for him, when he's reading Heidegger, he's seeing that like the language of authenticity is trying to get at what Marx calls alienation. One of the interesting things that I learned sort of historiographically is that it's only a couple years later than this that the 1844 manuscripts are finally published for the first time. And when he reads those, he sees like, oh, this was what I was looking for in Heidegger, right? This like philosophical account of alienation, and one that's tied specifically to, again, changes in the mode of production as a historical phenomenon that makes possible now a kind of freedom, maybe for the first time in civilizational terms. But I don't know, like how do you think of getting outside of these repressive apparatuses, and what is distinctive about modernity? Like he talks at certain places about like a repressive desublimation, which I don't know if you guys can you all help me unpack these concepts? I'd never know how to think Freud. This is one of my stumbling blocks. But it seems like he thinks there's something specific to the way that there is a kind of like a socially produced like disaffection or like an anti-cathexis or something like this.
Yeah, he like tracks. I mean, I don't fully understand this, but I think what he's doing is like tracking the emergence of like sublimation, so taking like raw libidinal energy and redirecting it into like socially accepted and socially valorized practices, right? And so like he's tracking this development, and like you said, Will, at a certain point he says this was necessary. It allowed us to become like knowledge creating animals. You know what I mean? It allowed us to generate it managed to make a bunch of progress basically. But then at a certain point he thinks like it. And he follows Freud here that it becomes productive of all these kinds of neuroses because of the way that the sublimation occurs. Is like
neurosis stuff.
For the vast majority of people, all this like sublimation of our libidinal desires gets all just invested in the private sphere of like a monogamous like patriarchal relationship.
Yeah.
Right. And so like the sphere of work there's no pleasure whatsoever in the sphere of work because it's it's labor. It's alienated labor. And the whole of your humanity isn't present, so there can't be the kinds of desire that is typically understood as amorous at play in labor, right? And so like the idea I think would be when he talks about this kind of non-repressive sublimation, that's all what I just described is repressive sublimation. We have to like repress all these desires and concentrate
desires like sublimated, like the reality principle is like pro forma the performance principle.
He thinks that is a novelty of capitalism, though. I think the performance principle.
Interesting. Yeah.
Because I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's all right. I'm just thinking out loud.
I think that the performance principle follows. I think Marcuse says somewhere from also the creation of new divisions of labor, of the productivity divisions of labor. And so what happens is it's not just the reality principle for listeners who don't know is this idea that basically not everything is possible. You don't just get to have birthday cake every day. Like you got to eat your vegetables. But the performance principle, at least what he says in the beginning of Eros' Civilization, is a historically specific form of the reality principle. And I think this is important for Marcuse because he wants to say if we confuse reality principle for the performance principle, we end up naturalizing forms of what Owen was calling repressive sublimation that might not actually be necessary. And so the performance principle is, think about the person who invests so much of their personality into their day job. I'm going to become the best manager ever, which means I'm going to be a cop. I'm going to snitch on all my fellow coworkers, but this is how I know I'm good. And I see Marcuse being like, isn't that kind of a brutal form of life? Where your self-worth is invested in this sphere where you don't even get to see the material gains of it, and it separates you from other people. And so your only release, as Owen was saying, is this really circumscribed private sphere that probably can't hold all that energy, which is why sublimation, I imagine, is necessary.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely right. And like the repressive sublimation for him like produces a kind of neurotic social atom, right? And all of the aspects, he talks about what a redeemed, or it's more Benjaminian language, but like what a transformed, that's his language, what transformed work would look like, so that it was work and not labor, right?
Yeah.
If it was disalienated work, that it would, the cooperative element of it would be invested with all of these sublimated, with all of these sublimated libidinal energy. There would be immense and new, unthinkable even kinds of pleasure in the cooperation of producing and reproducing our lives. But, again, none of that is possible under a regime of repressive sublimation.
I have questions. I want to go back to the Heidegger stuff, because one of the things that really stood out to me, the reason I kind of frame this all as alienation, as the primary issue, I feel like the encounter with Heidegger is really thought-provoking to me and disturbing to me. And it's one of the, I think, crucial ambiguities in how people talk and think about capitalism and what the problem with it is, and then, therefore, what the solutions to it are. So what do I mean by that? I think that the close proximity between these figures creates the ambiguous intellectual terrain in which right and left really merge in their critique of capitalism. Like, I think what bothers me about Marcuse isn't that, so like the things you just said, I don't really love thinking about things through the lens of sexuality, to be honest, but I'm not I prefer not to, but I do see the thing you just said as being an idea of the left. Like, you want to have a world that isn't constrained in the way that Will was describing, and that has a different set of incentives and a different kind of flourishing in the way that Owen was describing. But on the other hand, I just don't really see how you arrive at that kind of conclusion from the starting point that he has in his preoccupation with subjectivity and alienation, because I think that it can easily just go in the other direction as well. And that's why Heidegger is so attractive. There's a whole world of left Heideggerians, And to me, the normative criteria of so-called, yeah. But the normative criteria, like whatever is wrong with alienation, if it doesn't begin with some criteria to explain what you mean and who's doing what to whom, and, I like the domination language, this becomes very murky territory. And it feels to me like this is where you get the culture war element of it, where it's like there are some things I culturally see as left, like I like, that's cool, and then things I culturally know are pretty fashy, and I think that's bad. But the critique of capitalism is in so many ways the same. So that's what makes me feel like it doesn't generate good principles for me, and it actually feels frustrating.
I think that's a fair critique.
Yeah. I mean, I think the way that I look at it, and also I guess I'm echoing what the four of us saying. I'm not super jazzed at looking at sexuality. I think it's a problem. Just like keep that behind closed doors. We don't talk about this in private company. And I hear Freud just like, look at you, a good bourgeois subject. Well done, patting me on the head. Thanks, Dad. Freud. Well adjusted. But I thought maybe partially what's going on with Marcuse is obviously there's something deeply normative in the project, but he's trying to have a deeper explanatory mechanism for, I'm going to be rather vulgar here, it's just like, why are we so fucked up?
Right. Yeah.
And so I almost look as partially there's like this descriptive project that's looking for firm normative foundations that are just really hard to found. But it seems as if he's trying to say something like, we do have these energies, these desires, and how have they become historically mediated and captured by these structures? And we won't get at that if we don't find a way of talking about them. And so it seems as if he wants to say even things like working together and strategizing and doing that, that hard work that we know of as politics, the slow boring of wood, requires a type of energy, a type of cathexis that if it is constantly being diverted or distorted, you're going to have people who don't even know how to engage with one another without engaging in over-the-top aggression and bitterness. We've all heard stories of quote-unquote woke politics run amok, and I think someone like Marcuse, look at all of this venting, this frustration that doesn't have, a healthy channel. And so what it turns out into is like turning other people into objects that we just vent our rage and anger at. And so I see it as like trying to develop a type of descriptive framework, but you're right. I don't know what the firm normative foundations would be. It can go multiple ways, but it's like, I look around and I think lots of distorted subjectivity.
Right. So let me just reframe it. Like, why this way and not another way? So like the fasci answer to it is there is a different kind of authentic being. Yeah. Or there's a different way of reclaiming being, of expressing it. And this usually has to do with some sense of like destiny and community or whatever. I just want to know, like, outside of like cultural signals, the things I just like and don't like. Why would I choose one or the other, to be honest with you? Except for that one seems bad to me and one seems more like my milieu. So that's my problem. It's not just, part of it is normative foundations. I guess that's like the proper political philosophy way of putting it. But I didn't really want to suggest, I guess I could suggest that, but I'm trying to like, it's kind of like, which way, Western man? And like, why do I choose one way or over another when these criticisms of capitalism are frankly functionally the same?
Yeah. You could see like a certain kind of eco-fash, like kind of, we need to get back to like authentic life, and this mode of existence is totally alienating. So, let's build a massive wall and go back to some like pre-industrial although you can't really do that with him, I guess, because he does. So here's, I think, what his response would be that to be free, to go back to something Will was saying at the beginning, right, is to seize the necessity of your historical moment. And that necessity isn't like, there is one, look, maybe you can help me explain what that actually means. But like, he seems to think that the kind of new subject that he wants to appear in, the kind of other life that he hopes to see, as roughly as he sketches it, it isn't just any old possibility. He thinks that within the present, there is a certain necessity for overcoming certain contradictions, let's say, and that if we embed ourselves within the task assigned to us by the historical moment. But again, the way Heidegger went with that was like the task assigned to us is like nationalism. It's national destiny and all that, right? So like, look, here's what I would say is I do think it's possible to disarticulate what Marcuse envisions from those like fasci kinds of modes of authenticity or social transformation, but I don't know that it's there, but I don't know that it's a prominent central feature. You know what I mean? Like, I think the worry is totally is well founded, regardless of the fact that I think he would think that he's got some responses to it.
Yeah, and to be clear, I don't think Marcuse is a fascist. I'm asking more.
No. No, but how's it? Yeah, the question is, how is it very different?
I mean, yeah. Well, here's one other way.
Sorry, Herbert.
I love personally, just at a spontaneous level. I got a lot of love for Herbert, so I know he's not that popular in some parts of the left.
Oh yeah, and I actually have a lot of fun reading him as well. I think the other part of what's going on with the necessity is that through line for also Marcuse is that there's no turning back the clock, and so I actually see some affinities between Marcuse and Bloch on this point, where they think that there are dangerous utopias. The dangerous utopia of returning back to nature, returning back to unalienated life, but I think both of their answers, though, I'm actually writing something where I think they depart on how they use Freud. Bloch is really hostile to Freud. He hates the idea of recovery and anamnesis. He thinks it's always about something that we have yet to create that doesn't yet exist. While I think for Marcuse, a lot of this is recovering these energies, these desires that are in us. But both of them think something like this: these desires are there whether we theorize them or not. And so the political gambit is, how are those desires, those affects, those libidinal forces, how are they going to be sublimated and appropriated? And it seems as if you're right. They can be appropriated in a sort of fascist direction of we need to return. And what Marcuse seems to be saying is something like, if that is a project we want to militate against, we have to show that there's a different way of expending these energies socially. And so I think it turns back on this. It's like there is actually no necessary way that the reconstruction of psychic social life will go, but political projects will often try to speak to those levels and to just leave them on the table. is risky.
That's a
and
good point.
Bloch thinks that that's partially what happened with the rise of Nazism, that the territory of the utopian imagination was kind of abandoned by the left, and and this discourse of returning to the soil dominated, and it to horrifying consequences.
Maybe this is part of it too, that I'm thinking a little bit about Adorno's critique of Heidegger, and I think Marcuse is going to be very maybe aligned here, right? Like with the kind of ontologizing, naturalizing maybe that we get with someone like Heidegger, you're going to tell me that like anxiety is just like a fundamental structure of being, right?
Oh,
and it's like,
that's
okay,
nice.
Fundamental.
and it's
attunement.
like, okay, then there's nothing to do but like to manage that maybe, or like to think about like, it was boredom, right? Like Heidegger's got a whole lecture course on profound
Very
boredom.
long.
It's a very long, ironically boring discussion of profound boredom, right? But like when you're doing ontology the way that Heidegger does, you're saying something like, yeah, like, oh, you got anxiety, like for sure. That's because that's like inscribed in the very heart of being. There's nothing to be done about it. Whereas
It just sounds so fucking stupid when you say that.
It doesn't sound great. I will say that.
but then like, but this is like a problem for like left Heideggerianism. And I think like Marcuse wants to say like, no, this is why we go to historical materialism, right? It's the historical materialist analysis of this says like, yes, there are social, political, economic reasons that are like historically specific as to why we've got this boredom thing, why we've got this anxiety thing. It's not just fucking a fact of being, right? Like it's a historical thing.
It's not because we haven't read Anaximander's fragment enough.
Yeah, I love how he shows how ahistorical Heidegger is. Like that's his problem is he's trying to fill in the concept of historicity with like actual history.
Yeah, I mean,
this is the problem with historicity. It's like a ahistorical concept, and there is no history in Heidegger. There's like the history of being, which like comes to us through like etymology and different aspects of language and stuff. Like,
so
that's not history. And Gil, you tweeted something about this. I was reminded of when I was reading. I think you said something like a confusion about what materialism is. I can't remember what you were saying.
What tweet is this? What did I do?
You said something about historical materialism.
I love that Gil doesn't even
etymology.
remember his tweets. It's just God moves through him.
No,
He's a
I'm
mere
just a
vessel.
conduit for the divine. I am.
People who think that doing history or historical
it
materialism
was
is
etymology.
like doing the origin of etymology.
I think what I said was
anyways.
what I said was etymology is the historical materialism of fools.
Well, exactly, but or of
great.
Heidegger.
It just seems to me that a way of thinking about what's going on with Marcuse is, he was deeply formed by the Heidegger of it all. For one reason or another, he saw the limitations, but he was trying to rescue some critical tools and bring them into a historical materialist framework. Now, whether that's ultimately successful, I think, all four of us tend to think he probably did the best that one could do.
He shot his shot.
He shot his shot and produced some interesting stuff, but I'm not quite sure. But I think it's important that what he saw is that Heidegger talks about history and historicity, but it just seems to me there's no way Heidegger means the same thing as what we would mean when we're talking about relations and forces of production, when we're talking about the arrangement of social historical forces and real material possibilities for emancipation. I mean, Heidegger did think that Marxism and liberalism, they both flatten being, whatever that means. But that is the thing he said. So I'm sure it was deep.
So like,
but
yeah. Let me just say like something that I was struck by when I was reading this is like I think that in Heideggerian discourse there is a just crazy confusion between temporality and historicity. So like, we're talking about whatever it is to be a Dasein. I always like imagining like I've got a happy little Dasein. But when Marcuse is explaining like, oh, what is the historicity of Dasein? He's like, it's that there's a past for us that has been and a being present and a futural orientation. And I'm like, that's just being in time. That's just being a temporal being. That's not history. Why would you say that's history? To just like, have a past, present, and a future. That's so abstract, right? Like history is about, I don't know, the specific location that you occupy in time, like what you've concretely inherited, received
History is ontic.
It's
homies.
very ontic.
Yes, thank you.
Hate to let you know
History's
about
ontic,
that.
and it turns out that matters.
Y'all, I don't know how you feel, but I
I'm
love
pro-ontic.
the ontic. I love
I'm
it
pro-ontic.
so much.
Yeah. This is a
I've
pro-ontic
never tried to
podcast.
get ontological.
No, man.
I've just stayed straight ontic, and I've learned so much. I've learned so much.
I stay ontic.
I stay ontic, yo.
I literally came to the same conclusion when I was in grad school. People kept talking about and like I felt like when people talked about ontology or like being, it was always to like make sure that I was told that the thing I cared about was like the most superficial level of reality. Yeah. And then at some point I was like, no,
Not
I'm
the
just going to
deep-
hang there.
Yeah.
Like I'm going to stay there and like I'm going to marinate in
No,
superficiality.
yeah, I'm going to take the gamble. I'm going to take the gamble that there's more explanatory power in like actual historical research than in pure mysticism.
I just feel like, if I were Heidegger, it'd be like, that's cope. That's cope.
It's cope.
That's what happens when you don't read non-transliterated Greek, okay? That's your problem. I mean, to bring it back to Marcuse, who thankfully he does transliterate whatever Greek he uses, so homie
Bless.
for that one.
Bless.
Love it. I will say, so I feel like I've been like trying to like be on the bit of the Marcuse train, but I think the wheels do come off once we get to One-Dimensional Man, though. That is a relentlessly pessimistic text. My man is tired.
no.
Yeah.
He's like, y'all too affluent. Y'all have your Coca-Colas, your cars.
He's like, protesting is bullshit. There is no popular sovereignty. That's a bourgeois illusion. Like,
And listen how he ends the book though. Like I want to let you make your point, but he says,
Yeah.
Nur der hoffnungslosen Willen ist uns die Hoffnung gegeben. It is only for the sake of those without hope that hope is given to us. I swear to God, it's like, whoa, well, I'm glad I made it to page 200.
If you were expecting a solution, sorry.
Fuck.
Yeah,
he's pretty exhausted by the end.
Yeah,
I guess the one thing I would say, I don't know, maybe, I don't even know if this makes sense to me or if I'm committed to this, but I have an intuition about how difficult it is to do the kind of subject focused work in a Marxian framework that he does. Like there's a part of me that almost just at a kind of superficial level wants to give him credit for like focusing on these particular sets of problems where Marxists are always and I think in many ways rightly, get extremely frustrated and mad when you start trying to talk about what does revolutionary praxis look like? Like what do we do? How do we orient ourselves differently in the world? Like what does practice look like? And, a lot of the other Frankfurt School thinkers were extremely allergic to this kind of thing, thinking about revolutionary subjectivity, thinking about futures and getting a little too concretely utopian, which Marcuse certainly does. And I respect him for getting concretely utopian for all of the warts and like issues. I love this about Sartre too. Like I want to hear at least people struggle to think about what the process of getting from like point A to point B involves.
They make wagers.
What kind of subjective intervention does it look like? Collective subjective intervention. Like, what does it look like? What the hell might it look? I don't know. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think Marcuse. They make wagers. So Marcuse clearly made a wager. I mean, we haven't said much about his search for a new sort of subject. He made his wager on things like the feminist movement, even the Black student struggle. Mm-hmm. I sometimes don't think it's a fair philosophical argument to be like, we're now in 2022 and it seems like you were wrong. I think Marcuse thinks that whatever the intervention is going to be, there aren't going to be guarantees of success. And so he was just groping, around for any sort of two-dimensionality, not even three-dimensionality, something that will break through. And of course, by this point, maybe his diagnoses are wrong. And I think Foucault kind of clapped back to One-Dimensional Man. It's just like, oh, you think power is only repressive. It's also productive, though. Yeah. And
Hooray.
I think
I think that's a hit job, by the way. That's a hit piece, by the way.
I feel like Marcuse knows
There's
that.
plenty of productive elements of like repressive power in what he describes as repressive power in Eros and Civilization. It is productive of all kinds of desires. It's just they're not fulfilling ones.
They're crappy desires.
So I think there's such a when I remember when I first time I read that history of sexuality, like repressive hypothesis thing. I was like, oh wow, this is mind blowing. It's true. They're all so dumb. Everybody thinks like
Everyone's
it's been
so
like repression.
dumb.
And you literally
Got them.
go and like read any of the supposedly repressive discourses, and they're not at all like, you know, captured by this one dimensional, you know, to use that term, this one dimensional conception of the way that desire gets socially controlled and dominated.
As always, it turns out a lot of these people who get these hit jobs on them are way more interesting when you actually read what they have to say.
Yeah, no, to your point
sure.
though about like him making wagers, like there was a bit towards the end of One Dimensional Man where he starts you know what he reminded me of? He reminded me of James Boggs. He started talking about like there's like a paragraph where he says something that sounded like Boggs talking about the outsiders.
I was going to say the same thing. Yeah.
Where he's like,
actually,
he says like,
underlined that as well.
this is when he says he's like, he loses faith in like the working class as the revolutionary subject, and says it's this combination of outsiders, the unemployed and unemployable, deviants,
it's like sub-proletarian revolutionary potentiality that he's like starting to clue into. And like, this is a break with like a traditional orthodox Marxism. Like, you know, whatever else you could say about him, he's a heterodox Marxist, right? But there's something I think, you know, he's looking really hard for ways out.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say in a kind of clumsy way. That's what I really respect about his work, and that I don't think you see very often from more like structure and history focused Marxian work.
I mean, one thing that I wonder about this, because I'm working on some stuff about the Frankfurt School, because I am perplexed by these arguments about how they turn to culture, they leave political economy behind. And I think this is true as far as it goes, but like there's also this revived interest in thinking about the first generation, and thinking about what is unsaid. So like the things that they would have assumed about political economy, whether it's monopoly capitalism or contradiction and class structure, that just didn't get carried through into subsequent decades of work on these people. And I think that's probably also true. Like these people were just more clued in to the economic realities around them than later generations of academics would be, to put it mildly. But what really stuck out to me, and the reason I started us off with that earlier 1920 stuff, is like the way that the word exploitation doesn't appear at all.
True.
At all. Either in that early text, in the middle text, until One Dimensional Man, he basically says that exploitation is no longer the basis of the existing form of domination. So the only, I'll find it eventually, but like, those who are directly exploited are no longer the revolutionary subjects. So like exploitation plays this like really ambiguous role. It is both not the primary axis of critique, and therefore the limits of revolutionary subjectivity are external to the main thrust of the dynamic of exploitation, or they're on the margins of it. But of course, then he still feels like he needs to say that the future utopia, the coming society, the self-determining world would be free of these elements of exploitation. And I feel that like something important is, well, then why is exploitation a problem again? Like it does, because it wasn't a problem until you said that. It was only a negative problem. It was like a limit condition on how to think about subjectivity, aka the people who are no longer going to be the revolutionary subjects.
Interesting.
It's not a part of like the way of thinking about the dynamic of capitalism, the historical progression of it, but it still needs to be overcome. And my question is, why would it need to be overcome? You know, so there's something in the first generation of their resistance to thinking about exploitation that I think is like a really important part of why it takes the twists and turns that it does, and why it gets so pessimistic. Like, I appreciate the searching for the new subject, but there's also like, you're going to get pretty fucking desperate if you're not able to look at the center and you instead have to look at the margins, you know?
That is true.
Yeah, I think the way
that's valid.
I think that that's absolutely right. And it seems to be what happened with this first generation, then once we moved to the 1950s and 1960s, is that you have these people And this is, I believe that this is also, after the revelations of Stalin have come out. And they're looking around and they're seeing that it seems as if capitalism is as stable as ever. And whether this is correct theoretically or not, I think that these are thinkers who are saying it seems as if capitalism, contrary to what we believed, is not going to create greater and greater immiseration, and thus what would follow is greater and greater organization rebelliousness against capital. I think maybe rightly or wrongly, I'm saying that this is what I think their position was. They're like, oh fuck. Capitalism is actually raising the standard of living for those who we are hoping would be the kind of vanguard spear to move us beyond capitalism. So they're thinking maybe exploitation is less and less of an explanatory framework for us to understand why capitalism actually is stable rather than crisis-ridden. Nice. Now, I think, again, for us, 2022, 2008, 2020, 1970, 1980, we're like, no, I think I see a lot of crisis.
Crisis is definitely
but I think they're wondering, why is this not congealing into a political potency? Again, I want to say right or wrongly, but I just think
that's a good historical diagnostic, and it also helps explain why the sort of central normative category ceases to be exploitation and becomes repression, which is general enough to be able to encompass or ground a critique both of, like, American capitalist society and Soviet supposed socialism, right? Which is itself an incredibly repressive society. So I think they're looking for categories that are able to allow them to adequately, criticize both of these things. Yeah.
Well, and that's where the psychoanalysis, I think, becomes really important too, because instead of, like, in Eros and Civilization, far from talking about exploitation, and in One Dimensional Man too, he's going after the feeling of satisfaction that people have and showing that it is like an empty, illusory satisfaction. He calls it like mutilated satisfaction and mutilated pleasure.
I mean, but this is like why it's hard. So there's all of this discussion about false consciousness in sort of left critical theory world, and that's like the bogeyman thing that you're not allowed to like endorse. Like, false consciousness is a bad idea, people. But you can see why it became such a center point, and then the point at which people started to break with this way of doing critical theory, because if your main claim is that you don't have the right orientation on your own pleasures, intuitions, enjoyment, like enjoyment of cultural like products, I'm going to show you that everything you like is actually bad, then you do take this position outside, like that, outside of the subjects to which you are addressing yourself, whoever that may be, and you're telling them that you know better than they do. And you might be right, but that's why that epistemic like break with this way of doing things happens, because the anchor for telling people it's bad, like, it's domination, but it's like domination of a kind of domination that I have to tell you about in a way.
Because you're enjoying it, or you think you're enjoying it.
Because you're lapping it up. You're
at Dave and Buster's.
Yeah, Cheesecake Factory. You're watching Marvel movies.
Your Cheesecake Factory. Yeah.
Wait,
exactly. So
but Cheesecake Factory is objectively good, though, so I don't understand.
Oh,
that.
Will, let me explain your desires to you.
We'll leave that for the.
Oh no!
That's the after
Did I just
show.
get expelled from the group? Oh well. You know what's funny? I feel like I've said this to you. I think I've said this to you all in the group chat once. Fuck it, I'm going to say, I think that this is why Afro-pessimism doesn't work too well. Because when you do make this turn, I find that there are really interesting critical resources when you go to psychoanalysis. But when you forget that psychoanalysis works in a very specific scene of the analyst and the analysand, that if the psychoanalyst is going to say, I think there's something wrong with your desires, that is through this constant relationship of talking with the subject. Where do we put culture on the couch so that we can, do the analyst work of the analysand? I know some people, like, they're not going to like hearing that. I'm open to being proven wrong, but I just think that is a radical transformation of psychoanalysis from, at least its theory emerges from the practice of seeing patients, to becoming a free-floating critique that you're trying to merge with Marxism, those seem to be about two different sciences that have two different contexts. And so that leads you to becoming the analyst who knows better, who is, analyzing everyone's desires. And even if they say, that's not what I think, you're like, I'm pretty sure the ontological structures of your subjectivity are anti-black, so every no you say means you're saying, yes, I am anti-black. But this is what I'm making a joke, and for Afro-pessimists, sorry, I'm black, but sorry to be anti-black. But this is what happens when this just completely unhinges from, I think, that diagnostic scene.
And I know, like, most Afro-pessimists aren't very interested in doing politics, and in the promise of politics, but also just think about how much of a shitty strategy it is. Like, how much of a non-starter it is to, like, try to gather people and to try to unite people in a workplace or wherever it might be by telling them that their whole view of the world is stupid and the things that they like are stupid pleasures, and you guys are a bunch of idiots. All right, let's go do this.
Y'all didn't have a problem when I mentioned Cheesecake Factory, but other than that, I'm with her.
Well, I'm not trying to organize with you, Will, so I can tell you that I think your desires are dumb.
Damn.
So here's the thing that I'll say that, and I know I said in the first place, the contemporary controversies about Marcuse, we weren't getting into it, and I guess I will a little bit. I have listened to some, like, there are some various exposés, and I listened to a couple of podcasts preparing to this, like, of people talking about Marcuse and its relationship to the kind of current culture war and cancel culture and all of this. And I don't think that there's a straightforward relationship historically. Like, you're going to draw a line from, like, this is a different left-wing world. And also, just because I was wondering about the difference between Marcuse and a conservative critique of modernity, I like and try use that as like a conversation starter. I don't actually think Marcuse is a conservative. It's more like when you start with alienation and exploitation isn't the primary problem. The process that we have gone through over the course of the past hour to kind of bring out how that emerges with this like this kind of cultural false consciousness thing, I think that has a pretty direct relationship, like, in theory, to a kind of culture war attitude. So, like, you are telling people that their desires are somehow false, but it's like a very mystical way of talking about that. Like, you have to have good reasons why people shouldn't like the things they do, and people don't like being told what they don't like and why their tastes are wrong. They tend to get defensive, and so then you have reactions to this. So, like, that uprooting of the critique away from exploitation and toward culture, I think that was dangerous waters for the left to get into, not because there's no legitimate critique of capitalist culture. I happen to think there is. I think we live in a very alienated society, to be clear. I like the Cheesecake Factory too, but
Yes.
I've only ever had the cheesecake. It was 5 out of 10.
I'm just saying,
5.5.
and I like lots of trash culture. I'm totally unashamed of this. I don't come at me. I like read rom-coms. It's a whole thing. But there is a problem with, like, making that the basis of your contestation with somebody. Alienate, like, the different ways in which we react to our alienation and just challenging each other on that basis. I don't know. Like, that's a rough place to be in analytically.
Yeah. I wonder if there's, like, despite all of Marcuse's cautions and his, especially his emphasis on the importance of linking a critique of alienation and alienated life to like capitalism and to the economic, like, larger structures, it just is risky territory that, like, I think the way that people latch onto it immediately is to, like, think about their own desires and their own life. And then there's an avenue that seems to open up towards, like, well, maybe it's not going to be perfect. It's not going to be the most disalienated best life, but I'm going to, like, really find, like, niches of enjoyment and niches of, like, pleasure and consumption that, like, get me at least out of, like, the most, like, standard, the most, like, uniform, like, forms of enjoyment. Like, I don't know, but that even that, with all of the caveats you can possibly provide, I just don't know that, like, you can get away from that risk of if you center alienation, like you were saying, and not exploitation.
But even then, like, so what if you've got a uniform mode of enjoyment? Right? Like, so what if, like, everyone likes the same thing as me? Like, who gives a shit? If I like it, I like it. I don't, this isn't a strong enough basis, I don't think, for genuine critique. you know?
No, I think that's right. But I think, maybe if Marcuse had, really more firmly embedded the notion of the performance principle and the problem of exploitation, I think that really would have radically reshaped the theory. Because I think the performance principle is about the particular ways that we are constrained and enabled to engage with what is a historical form of labor. And so I think if you want to talk about, and I'm with Lillian, like, yeah, we live in alienated culture. I also like trash things. We can cut the difference and say, we're not saying something like all the desires we have are just great and healthy and are a product of a flourishing society, but you need a social explanation of what is causing those desires to be distorted. And I think the thin outline we get is the performance principle, which, as far as I can tell, once he gets the one-dimensional man, that type of critical material work he could have been doing fades away, and it becomes him just looking aghast at the world of affluence around him in the United States and thinking, how could any resistance be mounted? But this notion of how we work affects how we desire, how we conceptualize what is possible and what is good. That strikes me as something that could be promising and less polemical. But once you let that go and it's just free-floating desires, fucked up and all of that, then yeah, I wouldn't want to work with you.
All right, I think that does it for us today. New episodes of What's Left of Philosophy come out every 2 weeks wherever you get your podcasts. Also check us out on YouTube for videos and live streams. Before closing out today, we'd like to take a minute to thank some of the people who are supporting the show on Patreon. We couldn't do this without you, and we are really, really grateful. Today's new patrons are Kenechukwu Agwu, Michael Badu, Jeremy Riggs, Alistair Ilyich, Max Foley-Keene, Ava Cragg-Peterson, Paul Tisson, Patrick H.M. Morgan, Jacob Ainsko, Christine Payne, Emma Woodhouse, Jason Campbell, Jim Snedeker, John Schaefer, Will Singh, Ryan Gilbert, Benjamin Thompson, Andrew C., Chayu Kai, and Aaron. Thank you all very much. If you too like what we're doing and want to support the show, please go to our website, leftofphilosophy.com, and click the support button. Patrons get access to exclusive content like locked episodes, bonus videos, and access to our Discord server. You can also buy some What's Left of Philosophy merch from the store, linked on our website. Follow us on Twitter at LeftOfPhil, and don't forget to leave us good reviews and comments on your podcast app. With that, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hi, everybody.
Bye.